Okay, welcome everyone. Let's do a quick intro here to the concept of automation and more specifically automated attacks. I want to invite you guys to go ahead and watch this if you wish at an accelerated speed, and also many of the homework problems that you're asked to fill out very directly reference what we are going to go over here. So feel free to have that Google form open in a separate window and fill things in as we cover them. So to start with, some thoughts on automation generally. One of my favorite computer science professors had this saying that's just etched into my memory, and I think it's a really good one, so I want to share it with you. And that's simply that cyber is automation. So we're, as aspiring cybersecurity professionals, we're considering things on a very in great depth, and specifically as they apply to security and vulnerabilities and exploits. But even more fundamentally, our entire field is the result of attempts at automation. Whether we're talking about developing self-driving cars or managing electrical grids or just having computer networks that perform any of the long lists of tasks that computers and distributed computing do for us today, all of the issues that we consider in relation to cybersecurity arise out of these fundamental drive to automate systems. So it's worthwhile, I think, to just think a little bit about, what automation really is and what some of the fundamental implications are for automation as a concept. So let's give a little thought here to why is automation desirable? Well, there is a pretty long list. I'm sure you can come up with a lot of great ideas, but four sort of key ones that I think it's worthwhile to hit on here are: number one, it reduces human error. A lot of times we want to get humans out of the equation because if we can get a machine to do a task, we can reduce the error rate. Also, critically, when you automate things, oftentimes the speed of the process improves, and additionally, the scale of the process improves. And then finally, it frees people from dull and repetitive tasks and allows people to work in a more creative capacity. And all of those things are great upsides. We live in a world right now that's being just completely transformed by automation, and we're really just at the tip of how much profound change automation is going to have on the world. And there are a lot of upsides to that. But what are the downsides of automation? A couple of things I think we want to keep in mind are: number one, that machines, even though they can do all these great things for us, they don't have any common sense. They interpret everything completely literally. So when we design approaches to automation, it's really easy to create a system that we think makes sense because it makes sense to us when we design it. But when you consider all of the literal possible inputs to that system, sometimes machines can't handle every single case, and it's hard to anticipate every case that you need a system to respond to. And then, in addition to all of those improvements in scale that we can achieve through automation, one of the downsides is when you have machines that control really scaled up processes, when you have some of these design errors that don't anticipate possible cases that the system has to consider, then that can have a huge and vast consequence. If you've got one system that is running something very large, and there's a problem with that fundamental design error can now affect things in the world today, all across the world, and can really bring things to a grinding halt. So that's kind of a couple of things to think about with regard to automation generally. Now let's consider here what the role of automation is in the field of cybersecurity. So there are a lot of defensive applications of automation, and those, I think, primarily arise out of the reality that when you're working on the defensive side of things, you have to deal with huge volumes of data. So we have automated tools like intrusion prevention and detection systems to help us deal with just when we have an internet facing network or system. There's a lot of potential traffic that has to be considered, and all the rules that govern what goes in and out of that system. You really need that to be automated just because of the massive volume of traffic. Also, specifically, analyzing that traffic, there might be a bunch of different reasons why we need to analyze traffic. We might need to be looking for anomalies, and just the huge volume of data that we have to consider means we really need an automated approach to handle all of that. Another couple of applications on the defensive side are malware detection. So that's everything from your antivirus. I mean, you can imagine how impossible it would be for a human being to check all the files on a machine to determine whether they've been corrupted or whether they're some sort of malware is present. And then finally, all of these machines in our networks and automated systems, they generate huge volumes of reports and log data. So we depend a lot on the defensive side on what we call SIEMs, or security information and event management systems. And these are software systems that in an automated fashion aggregate all of our feedback from the devices on our networks, and in many cases generate notifications if there's something anomalous that we need to pay attention to. And another, sort of key concept for why we use automation on the defensive side is to increase the speed and scale of repetitive tasks. So a common example of this would be the vulnerability scanning. You have software and tools that will look at all the devices on your network and run through all the open ports on them and see if the devices on that network are vulnerable to a list of known exploits. And you guys in the other section you're doing on red teaming may get some sort of concept of this, but you can imagine if you're dealing with a really large system, you kind of need to automate that search for vulnerabilities. It's not really feasible to get a human being to go through all the potential devices that could have a vulnerability. So on the offensive side, and this is getting closer to our goal of talking about automated attacks, automation has a really big role in, again, increasing the speed and scale of repetitive tasks. So most commonly, we think about automated attacks and automation on the offensive side having a huge role in what we call denial of service attacks, or DOS attacks. And these are attacks that directly compromise that availability pillar of the CIA triad. So I think we've covered that in some of our intro materials in preparation for this hackathon, but it's useful to think about cybersecurity in sort of three broad categories: confidentiality of data, integrity of data, and availability of data. So if you can increase the speed and scale of what you're trying to do on the offensive side through an automated approach, a lot of times it's very useful in doing a denial of service attack. But on the offensive side, just as on the defensive side, you're doing vulnerability scanning to try and discover what your vulnerabilities are so that you can patch them before someone can take advantage of that. On the offensive side, you may be doing vulnerability scanning, or your adversary may be doing vulnerability scanning to find out what they can attack on your system. And doing that in an automated fashion is really crucial just because of the huge number of potential attack vectors that need to be considered. And then a couple of sort of specific areas in which automation gets used that might seem familiar to you are large-scale social engineering. So spam is generated usually in an automated fashion. It would be not really feasible to do spam if you had to type out each of the spam emails and send them out to all the different people that you want to try to do phishing or to deliver an exploit via spam. So automation is quite useful in that sense. And then also, again, large-scale execution and propagation of exploits. So you could think of a computer virus that self-propagates like a worm as being an example of automation. You only have to, as the individual, find one initial attack vector, and then you get that virus into a system, and it will bounce its own way around the system without you having to do any more work. And then also a really key again to this idea of denial of service attacks is the idea of a botnet, and that'll be something we'll cover in a couple of slides in a little more depth. So we talked a little bit on the last slide about a denial of service attack. So what is that really? It's an important term to know. Many of you may already be very familiar with this, but if you're new to this field, it's an important concept to hit on. So a denial of service attack is really any attack that compromises the availability. Again, that's one of our CIA, pillars of our CIA triad. Any attack that compromises the availability of a system or information. So that's really quite broad, and a lot of times inadvertently we may carry out denial of service attacks on ourselves if we try to install a patch on a system or do a operating system update that all of a sudden renders some software that we need to use inoperable, and all of a sudden we can't access the data we need. We've DOSed ourselves. That's on the IT side of things, that's a constant problem that you try very hard to avoid, but it happens. But really, just anything that takes a system offline or prevents access to information is a denial of service attack, by definition. But most commonly, when we talk about denial of service attacks, in sort of common parlance, that's most often referring to attacks where you take a system down by overwhelming it with a flood of traffic. And a lot of times that traffic is generated in an automated fashion by a group of devices that's controlled by the attacker. And this system where you have a group of devices working in parallel to generate traffic to take a system down, that's called the distributed denial of service attack. So the acronym here is DDoS, and DDoS is you'll probably hear that more than you hear DOS used. But then another key concept here is that this group of devices that's being used is commonly called a botnet. So what is a botnet? Okay, the name really says it all. A botnet is a group of devices under the control of one user. If you want to break the name down a little bit, bot comes obviously from robot, but that itself is derived from the Czech word for slave, which is robotnik, and that's sort of descriptive. And net obviously comes from network. So you think of a network of slaves. You have one, bad guy who's controlling the network, and he can get all of those slave machines to do whatever malicious task the adversary is trying to achieve. So it's important to realize that sort of historically the definition of a botnet usually just kind of referred to computers, but in this day and age, this can be any device that connects to the internet, and generates web traffic, and that includes devices like webcams, televisions. In the era we live in right now, where we're constantly bringing more and more devices online, the phrase for this is Internet of Things, or IoT. We have devices like refrigerators or toasters or Fitbits. All kinds of things are potentially capable of generating web traffic, and oftentimes today, if someone wants to build a botnet to generate, traffic for a DDoS attack, they'll seek out these sort of IoT devices because the security on those devices is a lot weaker, and they're easier to compromise and incorporate into a botnet. Some of you guys may remember within the last couple of years there was a massive DDoS attack on that took down like Amazon Web Services for the better part of a day, and most of the devices on that were webcams. That was the Mirai botnet. And so the Internet of Things security is a real concern. But botnets themselves, again, automation is this concept that just pops up everywhere. Botnets themselves, of course, are created through automated vulnerability scanning, coupled with automated exploit execution or self-propagating viruses. So if someone wants to build a botnet, it'd be very tedious to go, as an individual and try and find a webcam that's connected to the internet out there somewhere and deliver an exploit to that individual webcam and then go to a different one. Realistically, you have automated, vulnerability scanning that's looking at active IPs and seeing if they're susceptible to exploits in an automated fashion and building a botnet that way, or the self-propagating virus can also be very useful in a botnet, getting it onto one system and getting that system to infect other systems, very much like a biological virus, can be effective in developing a botnet. So, having talked a little bit there and kind of rapidly about some fundamental automation concepts and specifically how automation is used in common attacks, I think it's maybe a good idea to end here with just a couple of thoughts on what role automation might play in a hackathon project, because that's what we're doing this preparation for. So in the hackathon, you're going to have, a pretty constrained time period to work in a group on a project that you select. And it might really be a good idea, given the limited time frame and probably limited access to hardware for hacking, to use the hackathon as an opportunity to show off your programming skills or develop, your programming skills. So some ideas here, just, kind of considering the idea superficially, maybe your group would want to try and implement some software that automates a cybersecurity tool that is commonly used, like Nmap or T-Shark or Metasploit, and runs that tool at regular intervals and analyzes the results of running the tool, and then delivers that analysis via email to a system administrator. That might be a good type of project to work on within this confined time frame, and really have a cool project to flex your programming skills and show them off a little bit. A couple other ideas that just came to me off the top of my head are maybe you'd like to be on a team that implements a program that detects or prevents an automated attack. Could you write a program that uses a tool like T-Shark to respond or prevent a DOS attack? Or on the flip side, we talked about how automation, very briefly, we mentioned how automation can be used in generating spam to deliver exploits via email or to do phishing. Could you write a program that helps to detect spam or phishing by identifying keywords or common misspellings of words that are known to be frequent in spam emails, that does that keyword detection in the body of an email? That could be kind of a cool project to try and tackle over the day and a half or so that we have to work. I hope this has given you some overview of I think a pretty interesting and fundamental concept to our field, and I look forward to answering any questions that you guys might have, and seeing if you guys decide to choose any projects for the hackathon that focus on automation. Thanks a lot.